Hello, I'm Nelson Liu and thanks for joining us for Western Perspective. On this week's program, apartments are a popular form of accommodation for Western Australians, but the state government is now reforming legislation affecting strata in an effort to make it better for owners and residents while introducing new land development options. Stephanie Acevedo takes a look at why a change is in the works.
Many Australians have worked all their life to invest in their own home, but if you're investing in a strata property, everything could be about to change.
With regards to the changes we're seeing, they are quite substantive.
The current Strata Titles Act has been in effect since the mid-1980s, but is now considered to be outdated because of the complexity and range of current housing developments. Strata is an Australian innovation in property law which allows ownership of parts of a property known as lots, together with shared ownership with the Strata scheme.
There's a share which people will own within that scheme, which can usually be defined as unit entitlement.
The new legislation will direct property into the 75% of lot owners for schemes of 4 or more who could make a development to those against it. These changes are reportedly needed as by 2056 it is said Western Australia is expected to be home to over 5.6 million people.
There are quite a few, and within those schemes, you've got owner-occupiers, you've got tenants.
The new Strata Amendment Bill could be introduced into Parliament in the next few weeks, but there are plans for another review on this matter before then.
Well, despite the state government's plans, there are concerns about changes to the legislation that will affect the community. I sat down with WA Deputy Opposition Leader and Scarborough MP Lisa Harvey to talk about how the changes affect strata homeowners. What's your take on the legislation?
The legislation's quite old. There haven't been too many amendments to it during the time of its operation, and so we commissioned a big report into it. Out of that report, some recommendations for changes were made, and what we're seeing now is the legislation, part of it was constructed under the previous government.
So why amend it now?
It needed to be contemporised. I think it was 1985 when the Act first came into being. There weren't too many apartment blocks and high-density developments in Perth. Now we have over 350,000 of our dwellings fall under the legislation, and the legislation just wasn't contemporary to cope with the modern day living requirements.
There have been community concerns about that whole issue of termination. Are those concerns justified?
I think with the first formulation of the legislation they were. It puts a very onerous responsibility on an individual who doesn't want to move house. It's just making sure that you've really got a definite majority of support to wind up a scheme and to go to a compensation program for people who may not want to move.
Legislation is designed to provide safeguards, particularly for vulnerable owners. Does it guarantee that those owners are protected, or should they still be worried about their position in the process?
There are requirements in the legislation to provide assistance to those individuals during a scheme termination process. So this new legislation does actually introduce new protections.
And finally, you just said that you're in support of the amendments of this legislation. Does it meet the growing housing needs of the community?
I think it will, and I think importantly by having a process for the termination of schemes, what we can see is some renewal of our old housing stock. This new legislation will allow for the termination of those schemes.
And that's all for this week. We'll be back again next time, but until then, Ivan and Danielle, it's back to you.
Nelson, thank you very much. This week's main news again. Party disunity continues to haunt the Liberals, with questions over Home Affairs Minister Peter Dutton's parliamentary eligibility remains unsolved. Meanwhile, the by-election in Wentworth also threatened the government's majority. Political expert Dr. Ian Cook says there's a chance that voters in Wentworth might reject the Liberal Party. He also believes that it will be hard for the Morrison government to appeal to young voters due to policy dissatisfaction.
And that's our news for this week. You can follow the latest news on our website and Facebook page.
We'll be back in 2 weeks' time. Until then, good night, take care.
Good evening.